Oh, it's day two of this opposition parties convention to discuss what was known as the Moonshot Pact. Of course, that name is now changed to the Multi-Party Charter for South Africa. They're gearing up for the critical elections in 2024. Next year, it's all going to be about coalitions and multi-party partnerships. But also, we're hearing that the main aim is to unseat the ANC. But then if you hear from the political parties yesterday that are taking part, they're saying this is not about unseating a party. It's about providing a better alternative. In total, it's 7 political parties that will be meeting in Kempton Park again today for the final day of this convention. Let's bring in political analyst Ongama Mtimka, always very kind with his time. Ongama, morning to you. So your takeaway from the first day, we've got a new name, but how much are you reading into this name? Good morning.
Morning, Gareth. So if the opposition parties or the government, for that matter, were not meeting to try and reflect on how best to do coalitions, we would need to be worried as South Africans because it would show an unwillingness to learn. We've had coalitions for much longer than 2016, but in the period from 2016 until today, we have seen a lot of dynamics which necessitate that some mechanisms be established to try and improve the way in which parties in South Africa engage in coalitions. So that's the first thing. The national dialogue, as well as this initiative, is commendable for me because it's attempting to find a way in which to do coalitions better. Then, talking about the specifics of the matter, particularly your question about the change of name, it's been very interesting, Gareth. These parties have been worried about how they are perceived, who is perceived to be leading, and what attitude is demonstrated by those who are in a better position to lead coalitions. That is the DA and the ANC. And yesterday is as much about who was there as it is about who was not there at the moment. And for me, it shows that these parties shouldn't be hoping that yesterday's events are the culmination, but rather the beginning of even further processes of discussions, both led by the opposition groupings, but also by government with an intention to create the better regulatory framework and policy framework for getting coalitions to work in South Africa.
And you took me very nicely to what I was going to ask you about the formality of something like this charter as well, because that's been the criticism before, is it's really just a handshake and a press conference when there's a coalition agreement between two parties. But just like the changing of the winds in the southeast or in Cape Town, it doesn't seem to last very long. At the slightest whim, we're changing alliances again. What do you want to hear as far as formalities? Maybe contracts, maybe constitutional agreements. I'm not sure how high up the ladder we need to go here to formalize what really is a business partnership, to my mind.
Very interesting that you should frame it that way. So the biggest concern among parties that get betrayed by their partners in coalitions has been the powerlessness that the coalition that gets unseated because of betrayal by one party feels they have, the powerlessness that they feel they have in getting a party in a coalition to commit, and when it fails to commit, to have some mechanism of accountability. Now, the parties have had this tendency that they would be part of a coalition and then would aid to unseat the very same coalition should there be disagreements which they cannot tolerate, or should there be a better deal that is offered by a party that's in opposition but seeks to secure its a newer coalition to unseat the existing one. Now, your guess is as good as mine there, Gareth. I don't want to go ahead of the process in terms of what is going to be designed by these parties as a way to regulate that. The extent to which it can be regulated would be very interesting. Remember, we live in a democracy where the Constitution is the supreme law of the Republic, and the Constitution guarantees freedom of association. And is there a way to get parties to commit a lot more in ways that would allow them to be charged by others for breaking contract when they break out of coalitions. That's going to be quite interesting if they can find something that is legalistic as far as how to respond to a partner in a coalition that breaks away.
I'm very glad, Ongama, as a last question to you, brought up the constitutionally protected right of the freedom of association as well, because I'm also starting to think ahead, I'm sure as many of us are, to the election day itself next year. I'm talking about those voters who are going to come out. It's confusing at the best of times to try and decide who to vote for. Now we're throwing in 7 political parties, plus there could be other alliances as well. How does a voter try and make sense of something like a multi-party charter for South Africa? Because as you say, who's really in charge at this point? Who do you put your weight behind in next year's elections? How much more complicated is this going to be for us voters next year?
Excellent. So 2 things. It's in general systems theory, we recognize that one parts of a system are self-determinant and autonomous, but also they are dependent, right? Peter Groenewald yesterday was driving the message that as these parties come to the coalition, they retain their autonomy as parties, even as they contribute to creating this thing that's bigger. Now, I've said all of that to say voters who are preferring to vote for small parties, something which the DA has discouraged in previous elections, and it's going to be interesting how their election messaging is going to be like now that they're in partnership in it, that's more formal with smaller parties, right? So for voters, this is a simple issue. They know in advance that voting for one of the parties among the 7, and I think it might even become more, they are voting for a grouping whose politics is center-right to somewhat closer to far-right, right? And then also, when they vote for any of either the ANC or the EFF or any of the parties that may remain out at the time of casting the ballot, they know that they're voting for a party that is likely going to join a coalition that's center-left to far-left. And then there will be the ones that do not actually become part of any formal agreement before election. And I suspect that most of those parties will be the new, parties which are mainly centrist when I look at them. So I think the impressions of what groupings will be there are helping to give an indication to the voter that your small party is likely going to form an alliance with this group, and this is general ideological posture of that group.